Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're doing it, as promised, a massive benchmark comparison between the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D and Core i9-12900K. Now, we'll be comparing these two head-to-head across 40 games at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K using a wide variety of genres, from Battle Royale to real-time strategy. So there should be something for everyone. But before we go any further, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS's latest range of Intel Z690 motherboards, along with their ROG Ryzen 2 all-in-one liquid coolers. One of the most extreme Z690 motherboards on the market is the ROG Maximus Z690 Hero D5, packing a 10-phase V-core with two 90-amp power stages per phase, allowing it to overclock the 1200K to the max. Then, for cooling your overclocked 12th Gen Core Series CPU, there's the ROG Ryzen 2 360 LCD AIO liquid cooler, packing a 7th generation Assetto pump, Noctua radiator fans, and an embedded fan for the CPU socket area. So it harnesses both water and air to provide high performance cooling. And for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so for this big benchmark, one of my biggest concerns was how I was going to configure each CPU. Normally, I just test using low latency dual rank DDR4 3200CL14 memory for an apples to apples comparison, but I wasn't convinced that would make the most sense for these two CPUs, given that AMD and Intel are pitching them as the ultimate gaming processors. As a gamer, you'd really only buy the Core i9-12900K because you want the best of the best, at least from Intel. Whereas you'd buy the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D because you want the best gaming CPU the AM4 platform has to offer. So with each CPU claiming to be the best for gamers, I really thought that it'd make the most sense to test them with their ultimate memory configuration. But because I always like to get feedback from you guys, I created a poll on our community page, and the results really surprised me. Apparently, the way we normally test is what the majority of you prefer to see. And now, normally that really wouldn't surprise me, but with the Core i9-12900K, you do have access to high-speed DDR5 memory, so this isn't exactly a normal comparison. Anyway, 65% of you wanted to see a DDR4 3200 comparison, and that means 65% of you are going to be a bit upset with me. Personally, after having tested all four configurations for my day one 5800X 3D review last week, I found the DDR4 3800 versus DDR5 6400 comparison the most interesting. So that's why I've gone with that here, and hey, at least 35% of you won't hate me. This means that all of the testing you're about to see was gathered using the Core i9-12900K on the MSI Z690 Unify motherboard using G-Skill's Trident Z5 DDR5 6400CL32 memory, while the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D has been tested using DDR4 3800CL16 memory with the MSI X570S Carbon Max Wi-Fi. This is the fastest memory we can use with the Ryzen 7 processor while running at a 1-to-1 ratio with the FCLK. And this means that the memory used to test the Ryzen 7 processor costs $265 US, while the DDR5 memory used with the Core i9 currently costs $480 US, so an 81% premium there just for the memory. The other test system notes to be aware of is the fact that resizable bar is enabled using the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti. Okay, let's get into the data. Okay, so starting with Valorant using the medium quality settings, given this is a competitive title, the 5800X 3D pushes the RTX 3090 Ti to 668 FPS on average at 1080p, making it 15% faster than 1200K using DDR5 6400, or 32% faster when comparing the 1% low data, which is quite a significant performance improvement, though the Core i9 processor did allow for well over 300 FPS at all times in our testing. Similar margins were also seen at 1440p and 4K, because here we are heavily CPU limited in this title when using an RTX 3090 Ti with the medium quality settings, and this will likely be the case with most higher end GPUs. Fortnite also favours the 5800X 3D, at least at 1080p and 1440p, though it does more so for the average frame rate rather than the 1% lows. Here the Ryzen 7 processor was up to 11% faster, and it's not until we jump up to the 4K resolution that the margin is completely neutralized, and now both CPUs are limited to the same level of performance. Next up we have Call of Duty Warzone, and this title appeared to play better with the higher clocked Core i9-12900K, which pushed the average frame rate at 1080p 17% higher with a 21% boost to the 1% lows, and these margins remained roughly the same at 1440p. Even at 4K, the Core i9 processor enjoyed a reasonably significant performance advantage, and while it is difficult to get accurate numbers with these multiplayer titles, the data is based on a 3-run average. Moving on to ACC, I'm always seeing requests from viewers to include more racing sim titles, and recently a lot of you have been asking for ACC to be included in the big benchmark videos, so here it is. Interestingly, this one heavily favours the 5800X 3D, boosting performance at 1080p and 1440p over the 1200K by around 24%, though only up to 13% for the 1% lows. Then by the time we reach 4K, the game becomes entirely GPU limited using the RTX 3090 Ti with the medium quality settings. Another title that viewers constantly request for CPU benchmarking is City Skylines, and while I have included this one in the past, it's always proven to be a terrible title for benchmarking due to its single core nature, which creates a heavy bottleneck. But once again, due to popular request, I thought I'd give it another shot. For testing, I'm using a large city from a save game I downloaded for testing, since I don't have the time to sink countless hours into this one. Monitoring CPU utilization, it still looks to really only heavily utilize a single core, with an additional 2 to 3 cores utilized to the tune of around 20 to 30% with the 12900K. As a result, the game is still heavily CPU limited, and the massive L3 cache of the 5800X 3D doesn't help it pull ahead of the 12900K. It could certainly help relative to, say, the 5800X, but I don't have that data yet. Anyway, when it comes to City Skylines performance, these two CPUs are comparable, and both failed to hit 60 FPS, which speaks to just how unoptimized this game is and how poorly it does utilize the CPU. Though, admittedly, you don't really need high frame rates to enjoy this game. Another popular requested title is StarCraft II, and this one really only utilizes a single core, and while frame rates were much higher, the game is still heavily CPU limited. The 1200K was 5% faster, but both did push over 200 FPS in our mid-game replay. Apex Legends ran slightly better on the 5800X 3D, offering a small performance advantage over the 1200K, even at 4K. We're looking at a 4% increase at 1080p, 6% at 1440p, and then 5% at 4K, so around a 5% increase with the Core i9 processor. Certainly not a difference you'll notice, but the Intel CPU was technically faster here. Unlike Apex Legends, Dying Light 2 isn't a game where you need hundreds of frames per second, so either CPU works really well, despite the fact that the 5800X 3D was a little faster, delivering up to 7% greater performance at 1080p. Like Valorant, Rainbow Six Siege is a competitive title, so for this testing I've opted for slightly dialed down quality settings with the very high quality preset opposed to Ultra. We're really only GPU limited at 4K, and even their frame rates exceeded 200 FPS. At 1080p, the 5800X 3D was 3% faster, but then 3% slower at 1440p. Now, you could claim this is margin of error, but after numerous 3-run averages, the AMD CPU was consistently a little bit faster at the lower resolution and then a little bit slower at the higher resolution. And interestingly, these same performance trends were also seen in Rainbow Six Extraction using the Vulkan API. Now, although I did test Battlefield 2042, I'm going to look at the Battlefield 5 results instead because a lot more people are playing that game. Also, 2042 just sucks, and I was booted from my test server several times to get the data. For Battlefield 5 fans though, either CPU will serve you well. Performance was basically identical, despite the 5800X 3D having a slight edge at 1080p. F1 2021 was tested using the high quality preset, and still we're looking at well over 300 FPS at 1080p. The 5800X 3D was technically faster, but we're only talking about a 3% boost to the average frame rate, or a 7% increase in 1% lows. Then at 1440p, the 1200K jumped ahead by a mere 3% margin, and at the GPU limited 4K resolution, performance was identical. Moving on, we have Halo, and this one was up to 6% faster with the 12900K, but really performance overall was much the same. At 1440p, we're looking at over 150 FPS on average, with just a few frames separating either CPU. Even at 4K, frame rates remained above 100 FPS, though here performance was identical. And it's a similar story in Red Dead Redemption 2 using the high quality settings. In fact, here performance is identical, with just 1 to 2 FPS in it at 1080p, with nothing at 1440p and 4K separating them. The Outer Worlds is an Unreal Engine 4 game which typically favours Intel and Nvidia hardware, but here the 5800X 3D does very well. Impressively, at 1080p, the Ryzen CPU was up to 17% faster, seeing we're looking at the 1% lows, but even the average frame rate was still 14% higher. So a comfortable win at 1080p for the 5800X 3D. Even at 1440p, it was comfortably out in front, at least when looking at the 1% lows where it was 16% faster. Oddly, the 4K data still favoured the Ryzen processor, where it offered up to 10% more performance, so some strange scaling in this title, but a great result for the cache-heavy 5800X 3D. And the last game we're going to look at the results for is Death Stranding, and here the 1200K limited performance at 1080p to 212 FPS, making the 5800X 3D 13% faster, and this margin was only slightly reduced to 10% at 1440p. Then at 4K we are completely GPU bound, wrapping things up at 147 FPS. Okay, so we've now looked at a little over a dozen of the games tested, but with 40 in total, there's a lot more data that we need to go over. So to do that quickly, we're going to take a look at some breakdown graphs covering the 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions. Starting with the 1080p results, we see that the 5800X 3D was just 1% faster on average, but that's quite an impressive result given the Ryzen processor is using DDR4 3800CL16 memory, while the 1200K was paired with much more expensive DDR5 6400CL32 memory. The 5800X 3D enjoyed big wins in ACC, Valorant, The Outer Worlds, and Death Stranding, while it was 14% slower in Hitman 3 and Warzone. It's well worth noting that of the 40 games tested, 60% of them saw a margin of 5% or less in either direction, meaning the performance was very similar for the majority of the games tested, hence the 1% margin overall. Moreover, there were just 11 games where the margin was 10% or greater, and remember, we're using an RTX 3090 Ti, often with dialed down quality settings, so overall, these two flagship gaming CPUs are typically very evenly matched. Increasing the resolution to 1440p didn't change the margin. The 5800X 3D was just 1% faster overall. However, we're now looking at just half a dozen instances where the margin extended to double digits, with 29 examples where the margin was 5% or less. Again, ACC was the outlier, favouring the 5800X 3D by a 26% margin, while Warzone was the worst result for AMD. Then finally at 4K, the 5800X 3D was just 1% faster, so really the same performance overall. And this time Valorant and The Outer Worlds were the best titles for AMD, with CSGO being the only game where the margin extended to a double-digit loss. And we're looking at a margin of 3% or less in 26 of the 40 games tested, so that meant 65% of the time we're looking at basically identical performance at 4K, as here we are generally quite heavily GPU bound. As we discovered just a few days ago now, the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D is a great CPU for gaming, offering big gains over the original Zen 3 models to match Intel's latest and greatest. Our day one review did only feature 8 games, but from that sample, the 1200K paired with DDR5 6400 memory was 2.5% faster. Today, with 40 games, it's 1% slower. So really much of a muchness there, and both datasets point to these flagship parts delivering comparable gaming performance. Based on that, I expect across the 40 games just tested, the 5800X 3D would be around 7 to 8% faster than 1200K if they were both using the same DDR4 memory. So not a massive margin, but the Ryzen 7 part would be the superior performer overall. This means when compared to the Core i7 12700K, I'd expect the 5800X 3D to be around 10% faster, so perhaps I could add that processor to the data soon if you guys are interested. On that note, I'm also very keen to add the Ryzen 7 5800X to this 40 game sample, as it should be very interesting to see when and where the L3 cache comes in handy. So there's certainly a few interesting spin-off comparisons I could make, so let me know what you'd like to see in the comment section. As for the Core i9-12900K versus Ryzen 7 5800X 3D battle, if you watched my day one review, I feel that summed it up best, and although I have tested 5 times more games here, the conclusion really does go unchanged. For those seeking maximum gaming performance but don't want to go stupid with pricing, and they do care a bit about power efficiency, then the 5800X 3D seems like the obvious option. The advantage of the 1200K though, being that the LGA 1700 platform will support at least one more CPU generation, whereas this is the end of the road for the AM4 platform. You could also argue that the 1200K can be overclocked, but honestly, you're really not getting that much more out of this thing, and stock, it's already quite a handful to cool. So I personally don't place much weight on the overclocking angle for this part. Really, you are going to extract significantly more performance via memory tuning, and that is of course also true for the 5800X 3D, given core overclocking isn't supported. In my opinion, both of these CPUs are really targeting gamers who are seeking the best of the best performance. I have mentioned before though how I believe the 12th gen Core i7 range makes more sense for gamers, but make no mistake, the extra 20% L3 cache offered by the i9s does make a difference when it comes to ultimate gaming performance, which is what we're talking about here. And if you are after the very best gaming performance, you're unlikely to settle for DDR4 memory with the Core i9-12900K. You probably would with the 12700K, but not the i9 model. Likewise, you're not going to use DDR4 3200 or slower with the 5800X 3D. DDR4 3800 seems more fitting, which is why I tested that configuration. The Core i7-12700KF, that is cheaper than the 5800X 3D, so in terms of value that part should match up pretty well if using DDR4 3800 memory. So that's probably how I'll test that part, as I'm not sure pairing it with $480 US DDR5 memory would be the right move now. And by using DDR4 memory, that would also provide us with apples to apples data, which I could also compare with the 5800X should I test that part. So with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. Again, the 5800X 3D is very impressive, but so too is Intel's Alder Lake series. So plenty of great options there on both sides. And of course, that's always great news for consumers. Again, let me know which CPUs you'd like to see added to this data set next. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Also, we have Patreon and Floatplane, so you can subscribe to either one of those if you want to. It'll get you access to stuff like the Hardware Unboxed live streams each month. We have a Discord server, a private Discord server there for Hardware Unboxed members, behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, check that out. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.